December 16, 1944. Before dawn, the Ardennes forest lay frozen in silence, a world locked in white. At 5:30 a.m., the stillness shattered. The ground quaked as German artillery thundered across 85 miles of front fire and steel, ripping through American lines thought to be resting in safety. In the snow-choked villages near Monschau, young American replacements clutched their rifles with trembling hands. They had come here expecting quiet a place to recover from war's brutality. Instead, the forest itself erupted, every tree shaking with the violence of Hitler's last gamble. From the shadows surged columns of gray uniformed soldiers, veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk men, hardened by years of war. They advanced with brutal confidence, convinced this strike would split the Allies apart, that Antwerp would soon be theirs. Their boots crunched on ice, their breath steamed in the frozen air, their faces set with grim resolve. Opposite them, the Americans, understrength, undertrained, and unprepared, faced annihilation. It was the perfect storm of imbalance, hundreds of German tanks against scattered cavalry patrols, waves of seasoned grenadiers against thin lines of exhausted defenders. Hitler had promised his generals the enemy was weak, that this blow would turn the tide. On that bitter morning, it seemed he was right. The first hours belonged to the Reich, and the Ardennes quivered under its fury. Yet amid the chaos, a single decision waited to be made, one that would unleash a weapon so strange it defied the old laws of war. The soldiers of both sides could not yet know it, but within this frozen battlefield, the sky itself was about to become a killer, and from that moment forward, nothing in war would ever be the same. The thunder that broke across the Ardennes that morning was not chaos without purpose. It was the opening act of a carefully orchestrated gamble, a desperate scheme, conceived in the mind of a dictator who refused to admit defeat. Hitler had promised his inner circle that Germany would not die on its knees. He envisioned one last strike, a blow so devastating that it would split the Allied armies in two and shatter their will to fight. The plan was codenamed Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, and it was nothing less than the final throw of the dice for a crumbling Reich. The objective was brutally simple, yet ambitious beyond measure. Strike through the weakest sector of the Western Front, cross the Meuse River, seize the port of Antwerp, and in doing so, sever the Allied lifeline of supplies flowing into Europe. With the Allies divided, Americans cut off from the British, Hitler believed political cracks would widen into fractures. He convinced himself and his generals that Washington and London would lose the stomach for sacrifice, that they would sue for peace, and that the Reich might yet survive. It was a fantasy built on desperation, but desperation was all Germany had left. To execute this vision, Hitler summoned the last strength of his armies. More than 2,000,000 troops were gathered in secret, drawn from battered divisions. Volksgrenadiers scraped from the ruins of cities, and SS veterans hardened by years of slaughter on the Eastern Front. Nearly 1,000 tanks rumbled into hidden positions. Panthers with their sleek, predatory lines, Tigers with their massive guns, armored beasts meant to terrify by sight alone. Almost 2,000 artillery pieces were concealed under the forest canopy, their muzzles trained on unsuspecting American lines. In the secrecy of night, convoys moved under cover of fog headlights, blacked-out engines, muffled. Villagers along the roads watched in silence as the might of a dying empire crept through their towns like a phantom army. American intelligence failed catastrophically. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a place for worn divisions to rest, for raw recruits to acclimate to the front. There were no signs of alarm. No sense that the greatest German offensive since 1940 was gathering only miles away. Snowstorms masked the movement of men and machines, and radio silence cloaked the buildup in secrecy. Allied commanders assured themselves the Germans lacked the fuel, the manpower, and the will to mount a major offensive. They were wrong. The silence of the forest hid a monster waiting to strike. When the first German shells screamed into the sky on December 16th, the Americans were thrown into chaos. Entire regiments vanished beneath the opening barrage. Communications collapsed as lines were severed, radios silenced by thunder. At the front, men stumbled from their foxholes in disbelief, caught in a storm they had not seen coming. It was the nightmare Hitler had promised the Western Front aflame, the Allies stunned and reeling, the way to Antwerp seemingly open. For the men of the Wehrmacht, the offensive carried a weight heavier than their weapons. Many knew this was not merely another battle, but the last chance to alter the fate of their nation. Rations were short, fuel was scarce, and the Eastern Front bled daily under the Red Army's relentless advance. Families at home starved, cities lay in ruins. Yet here in the Ardennes, their Führer demanded one more sacrifice. They marched with frostbitten faces and hollow eyes, driven less by faith than by fear of what awaited if Germany fell. Still, their commanders told them victory was within reach, that the Americans were soft, inexperienced, unprepared. The forest echoed with the crunch of boots, the metallic growl of tanks, the promise of vengeance. Hitler's generals, though many doubted the plan, in secret obeyed. They remembered 1940, when German armor had swept through the Ardennes in a lightning strike that toppled France. Why not again? Why not believe that history could be repeated? They watched the columns assemble with grim hope, telling themselves that the Allies had grown complacent, fat with success and blind to danger. If Antwerp fell, if the Allies fractured, perhaps the impossible could become possible. And so the offensive rolled forward with terrifying force. Panzer spearheads punched into thin American lines. Volksgrenadiers surged through snow-laden valleys, and artillery roared like Judgment Day itself. In the first hours, it seemed as though Hitler's fantasy might take shape. Villages fell, crossroads were seized, prisoners marched back in columns of despair. American replacements, boys barely trained, were swallowed by the tide. Their rifles clutched uselessly as tanks crushed the snow beneath their treads. In command posts, frantic officers radioed for reinforcements that would not come in time. Yet beneath the fury of this offensive lay a hidden fragility. Fuel shortages forced German tank crews to siphon gasoline from abandoned vehicles. Ammunition dumps were rationed, convoys delayed. Every mile gained drained reserves that could not be replaced. For all their power, the German columns advanced on a razor's edge victory, balanced precariously against collapse. The Ardennes offensive was not a triumph waiting to be claimed, it was a gamble with no margin for failure. And as the Wehrmacht stormed forward, they carried with them a fatal ignorance. They believed they were fighting the same war they had fought for years, where foxholes shielded men from artillery and trees blunted the blast of shells. They believed in the old rules of survival, the patterns they had learned in blood across Russia and France. But in the forests of Belgium, those rules were about to be broken. A weapon they could not imagine waited silently behind American lines, a secret born not of battlefield experience, but of laboratories and factories half a world away. This was the stage upon which Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson and his gunners would soon act. The American lines, thin and battered, seemed on the verge of collapse. Monschau trembled as gray-clad soldiers pressed forward, their confidence mounting with every step. Yet behind that fragile line, in the cold gun pits of the 406th Artillery Group, a single decision was about to be made. The Germans thought they were marching through weakness, but they were walking into the jaws of something new. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last great gamble, a storm meant to drown the Allies in shock and fire. But it would also become the proving ground for a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. The battlefield was ready, the trap was set, and the moment was coming when the sky itself would turn against the Reich. This was the true beginning, the place where desperation met innovation, and where history would pivot forever. What the German soldiers marching through the Ardennes did not know was that behind the thin American lines, hidden in crates stacked near artillery positions, rested a weapon born not in the mud of trenches, but in the silence of day. Laboratories. It was small, almost ordinary in appearance, a steel shell indistinguishable from thousands of others. Yet inside its nose was a secret guarded as closely as the Manhattan Project. It was called the proximity fuse, and it would change not only the Battle of the Bulge, but the very nature of war itself. The story of this fuse began years earlier in 1940, when the United States found itself staring at the abyss of global conflict. Airplanes were growing faster, deadlier, more numerous, and traditional anti-aircraft guns could not keep pace. Artillery relied on time fuses, set by hand, calculated by slide rules prone to error. Most shells exploded too soon or too late, leaving enemy bombers free to rain death on cities and fleets. What was needed was a weapon that could think for itself, that could know the moment to detonate. The idea was radical. Put a tiny radar into a shell, let it sense when it neared its target, and trigger the blast at the perfect instant. It sounded impossible. A shell fired from a cannon endured forces 20,000 times greater than gravity. Temperatures inside the barrel reached 3,000 degrees. The spin of rifling twisted electronics into wreckage. Nothing so delicate as a radio tube could hope to survive. Yet in a nondescript building in Silver Spring, Maryland, disguised as a second-hand car dealership, a team of scientists set out to achieve the impossible. They were led by Dr. Merrill B. Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, a man who believed that science, when pressed by necessity, could conquer limits. For months, his team lived in secrecy and exhaustion. Engineers bent over benches lit by single lamps, glassblowers shaping ampules, no bigger than a fingernail. Technicians soldering wires so thin they trembled at the touch. Every night they carried home the weight of failure. Every morning they returned knowing that each day lost was another day. American soldiers bled without their weapon. Their wives and children often did not know what they were building. They were told only that it mattered, that victory might depend on it. Step by step, the impossible took form. Vacuum tubes, once the size of a fist, were shrunk to the size of a pencil eraser. Each fuse carried 4 or 5 shielded by ingenious cushioning that absorbed the shock of firing. Glass ampules filled with chemicals shattered at launch, creating instant batteries to power the circuits. The radar signal was weak, a whisper compared to the roar of the battlefield, but it pulsed faithfully from the shell's nose, searching. When it sensed a reflection off the ground, a treetop, or the curve of a helmet, the fuse knew. It detonated not on impact, but in the air, scattering fragments downward in a lethal cone. For the first time in history, a shell could decide for itself when to kill. By 1944, American industry had embraced the project with a fury that mirrored the urgency of the front. More than 100 companies abandoned peacetime production to manufacture the fuse. RCA General Electric Sylvania Crosley names once stamped on radios and refrigerators now etched onto crates of death. Entire factories were repurposed, their assembly lines manned by young women working 12-hour shifts, soldering 130 tiny components with microscopic precision. Each fuse was tested, tracked by serial number, fired in trial batteries until failure rates dwindled to near zero. The cost was staggering, over $1 billion wartime dollars, second only to the atomic bomb. But the result was a miracle of miniaturization, a triumph of science against physics itself. In the laboratories, men like James Van Allen, who would later discover the Earth's radiation belts, cut their teeth perfecting the electronics of destruction. They learned to make machines that could endure shock heat spin and still function with precision. What they created was not only a weapon, but a blueprint for the future: guided missiles, satellites, smart bombs. Yet in the winter of 1944, all of that was unknown. What mattered then was survival. The proximity fuse was ready, and the battlefield of the Ardennes would be its proving ground. While America raced forward, Germany faltered. Their scientists at Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had toyed with similar concepts as early as 1940. They built prototypes, tested crude versions of radar-triggered shells, but Hitler demanded quick victories, weapons that could be fielded in months, not years. He scoffed at projects that consumed resources without immediate results. The fuse program was shelved, its engineers reassigned, their warnings ignored. The Reich, obsessed with V-weapons and miracle tanks, dismissed what seemed too complex, too fragile, too unrealistic. By the time they realized the Americans had succeeded, it was too late. That was the fatal difference. In the Ardennes, German soldiers advanced with confidence drawn from years of battlefield survival. They believed foxholes and trenches shielded them, that trees blunted the force of shells. They had endured barrages at Stalingrad, Kursk, Monte Cassino. They thought they understood artillery, that they could read its rhythm, find its pauses, cling to its blind spots. But the proximity fuse rewrote the rules. Foxholes became traps, trenches became graves, forests became death machines, as branches exploded into wooden spears. Veterans who believed they had seen every face of war would discover they had seen nothing like this. The gamble of Hitler's last offensive had been set in motion with tanks, divisions, and arrogance. But waiting quietly unseen was an American invention no amount of courage could withstand. In the snowbound forests, technology would clash with desperation, and for the first time in history, the sky itself would kill with precision. The men of the Wehrmacht thought they were fighting soldiers. They would soon learn they were fighting science. The fuse was ready. The crates were open. The gunners of Colonel Axelson's 406th Artillery Group loaded shells that looked ordinary but were anything but. The German columns pressed forward, unaware that the rules of survival they trusted were already obsolete. The stage was set, the secret prepared, and in moments, the Ardennes would become the graveyard of Hitler's last gamble. The crates had been opened, the decision made, and the moment had come. In the bitter cold of the Ardennes, with German columns surging toward Monschau, Colonel Oskar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group gave the order that broke every regulation and rewrote the rules of war. His gunners, their breath frosting in the air, slid the strange new shells into the breeches of their howitzers. They looked like any other round, but Axelson knew what lay inside. With a pull of the lanyards, the barrels thundered, and the first proximity fuses left their guns trailing smoke against the gray winter sky. For the men of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division advancing through the forest, the sound was familiar. They had endured barrages on the Eastern Front in France and Italy. They knew the rhythm of incoming artillery, the whistle, the delay, the crash into the earth. They dropped into ditches, pressed against the trunks of trees, and waited for the explosions to plow into the frozen ground. But what came was not what they expected. The shells never struck soil. They burst high above the treetops, bright flashes tearing the morning apart, and the sky itself rained death. Steel fragments cascaded downward in a storm, slicing through branches, shredding bark into splinters that became deadly spears and cutting into the flesh of men who thought they were hidden. Foxholes that had always offered safety became coffins as fragments plunged straight in from above. Trenches once considered sanctuaries turned into killing zones. Soldiers screamed as comrades vanished beside them, torn apart by invisible hands. Entire squads were erased in seconds, their bodies buried under shattered wood and snow. The forest that had sheltered them became a trap, every tree exploding with lethal energy. Confusion spread like wildfire. Veterans of Stalingrad, men who believed they had survived the worst horrors war could offer, shouted in disbelief. They swore the shells had eyes, that they hunted men in hiding, that no shelter was safe. One platoon tried to scatter, running across open ground to escape the tree line, but the airburst followed them, detonating above their heads, cutting them down before they reached the other side. Another group huddled against a stone wall only to be shredded as fragments rained down from above, bypassing their cover as if the laws of physics themselves had changed. Panic was contagious. Officers shouted, orders drowned out by the relentless thunder overhead. The shriek of incoming shells no longer offered warning because the explosions did not land ahead or behind, they detonated everywhere at once. Soldiers stumbled through the snow, dropping their rifles, clawing at their helmets, as if metal could protect them from the steel fragments slicing through the air. The confidence of the opening days of the offensive, the belief that the Americans were weak and the Ardennes, a quiet sector, evaporated in an instant. The march to Antwerp faltered beneath a storm that no one had anticipated. Back at the gun lines, Axelson's men watched with grim determination. They could not see the Germans directly hidden by trees and distance, but they felt the effect in the rhythm of their fire. Instead of long pauses for adjustments and corrections, they fired steadily each round, detonating with uncanny precision. Scouts reported broken formations, men fleeing in confusion, German attacks unraveling. For the first time, the Americans sensed that they had unleashed something new, something that would tilt the balance. What had been a desperate defense was transforming into a slaughter. The reports from the front were staggering. Survivors spoke of foxholes filling with blood, of comrades shredded before they could even cry out. Some described the sensation of the air itself, turning solid, filled with invisible blades, cutting everything in reach. Others said the trees betrayed them, branches exploding into fragments sharper than knives. Fear spread faster than the shell fragments themselves. Rumors of a secret American weapon raced through the ranks, death from the sky fire that followed no-rules artillery with eyes. Units hesitated to advance, commanders struggled to rally their men, and momentum began to bleed away. At Monschau, where the 38th Cavalry Squadron had faced annihilation, the tide shifted. The Germans pressed forward in tight formation, confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm the thin American line. But the proximity-fused shells tore into them from above, ripping entire companies apart in seconds. Cavalrymen who had braced for death watched in stunned relief as the enemy disintegrated before their eyes. The snowfield that had seemed certain to become their grave became instead a charnel ground for the attackers. Axelson's disobedience had saved them, and in doing so, he had introduced a weapon that the Germans could neither predict nor withstand. The psychological toll was immense. German officers reported men refusing to leave their foxholes, paralyzed by fear of the sky. Some begged to be transferred to other fronts. Others deserted outright, fleeing into the forest rather than face another barrage. For decades after, survivors would remember those days as something beyond ordinary combat. They spoke of invisible hunters of shells that seemed alive, of a battlefield where the very air had turned against them. Veterans who had faced tanks, machine guns, and bombers said nothing compared to the terror of artillery that detonated overhead, and this was only the beginning. The first barrages had proven the fuse worked, that it could survive the unimaginable violence of being fired, that it could function with deadly accuracy in real battle. What Axelson unleashed at Monschau would soon spread across the Ardennes. Eisenhower, once cautious, lifted restrictions and ordered the weapon's full deployment. Shells with radar eyes flowed to every artillery unit, each round carrying the same promise. No more safety, no more shelter, no more survival by luck. The Germans had marched into the Ardennes, believing they would fight a familiar war. They had trusted in trenches and camouflage, in tactics honed through years of brutal struggle. They had believed in the strength of their veterans, in the power of their tanks, and the element of surprise. But at Monschau, in the forests of Belgium, they discovered that all of it meant nothing. Technology had rewritten the rules. The sky itself had become the enemy. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of explosions faded, one truth was undeniable. The Battle of the Bulge would not be remembered only for tanks in the snow or infantry locked in bitter struggle. It would be remembered for the moment the proximity fuse entered history, when a weapon that seemed impossible turned the tide of Hitler's last gamble. What began in the hidden laboratories of America had now revealed itself on the battlefield, and from that moment on, the outcome of the Ardennes was no longer in doubt. The Germans had gambled on strength and surprise. What they faced instead was science. And against science, their veterans, their trenches, their courage were nothing. The death that fell from the heavens at Monschau was only the first chapter of a storm that would sweep across the Ardennes and decide the fate of a continent. The first strikes at Monschau had proven the weapon worked. The Germans who thought foxholes would save them now lay shattered in the snow, victims of shells that seemed to know where they hid. Word of the weapon spread quickly up the American chain of command. Eisenhower himself, once cautious about revealing the secret, lifted restrictions. The order was simple: unleash it everywhere. Trains and convoys carried crates of proximity fuses across the Ardennes, and soon every artillery unit, from the smallest field battery to the massive self-propelled howitzers, had shells that could turn the sky into a killing field. The battlefield that had been tilting toward disaster was about to shift with brutal finality. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division clung desperately to the crossroads that controlled the southern Ardennes. Surrounded, cut off, and vastly outnumbered, they faced the full weight of German pressure. Panzer columns closed in infantry, advanced across open snowfields, and artillery rained down in ceaseless bombardment. The Germans believed Bastogne would fall in days. They sent demands for surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe answered with one defiant word: nuts, and prepared to fight. His confidence might have seemed suicidal, but behind his paratroopers stood the unseen hand of artillery, armed with proximity fuses. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, operating in freezing mud and relentless snow, fired over 7,000 rounds in 2 weeks. Every barrage carved holes in the German advance. Infantry that once relied on closing quickly across fields found themselves shredded before they came within range. Shells detonated above fragments sweeping downward in lethal cones that erased entire waves of attackers. Paratroopers in foxholes cheered as the barrages broke each assault apart, turning the frozen fields into graveyards. The siege that was meant to starve the 101st into submission instead bled the attackers white. Bastogne held, and with it the backbone of Hitler's offensive, snapped. Farther north, the battle for Elsenborn Ridge became a crucible. Here the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, backed by artillery, faced the elite of the Waffen-SS, the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the feared Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division. For 3 days, the Germans hurled their best against the American lines, tanks grinding up steep forested slopes, infantry pushing relentlessly in wave after wave. The Americans held the high ground, and their guns never stopped. Over 160,000 shells fell in that sector alone, and though only a quarter carried proximity fuses, those accounted for more than half the German casualties. The results were staggering. Entire SS companies disappeared in moments, torn apart before they could close with the defenders. Survivors climbing over the bodies of their comrades were cut down by the next salvo, the airburst fuses, ensuring no shelter remained. The slopes of Elsenborn became littered with burning armor and shattered men. The divisions that Hitler had called his pride, veterans sworn to fight to the last breath, broke against invisible fire from above. Reports from the front described panic, hesitation, and disbelief among men once considered invincible. The ridge never fell. Instead, it became the anvil upon which the German offensive shattered. General George S. Patton himself witnessed the new weapon in action as his Third Army drove north to relieve Bastogne. On Christmas night along the Sauer River, German troops attempted a crossing under cover of darkness and fog. They believed the night protected them, that surprise would give them the advantage. But American guns opened fire with proximity-fused shells detonating high above the water. In minutes, the frozen river turned into a slaughterhouse. When daylight came, 702 German bodies lay counted along the banks, a battalion erased almost to the last man. Patton, who had seen war in all its forms, later wrote that the funny fuses had won the Battle of the Bulge. Coming from a man who trusted more in grit than gadgets, it was the ultimate testimony. Even the skies above Europe bore witness to the shift. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive strike by nearly 900 fighters against Allied airfields. It was a desperate gamble to cripple Allied air power. The surprise was complete. Dozens of planes burned on the ground. But as German pilots turned for home, they flew into a wall of American anti-aircraft fire, armed with proximity fuses. The difference was merciless. No longer did gunners have to guess range or timing. Shells burst precisely where they would do the most damage. Of the 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 fell to anti-aircraft fire. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding, never recovered. It was their last great assault, and it ended in ruin. Everywhere the proximity fuse appeared, German momentum died. Attacks that should have broken through stalled in confusion. Infantry refused to advance into fields swept by airbursts. Tanks hesitated without infantry support, becoming easy prey for bazookas and anti-tank guns. Commanders who had once relied on disciplined formations found their men scattered, their plans disintegrating under a rain of steel. By the last week of December, what had begun as Hitler's great gamble had turned into a slow collapse. His armies trapped in the snow, bleeding out against an enemy they no longer understood. For the Americans, the weapon brought not only salvation, but pride. The African-American gunners of the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, often overlooked in official histories, carved their place in legend with their use of the fuse. At Bastogne, their relentless salvos created a ring of fire that no German assault could penetrate. Their contribution was decisive, though their recognition came decades too late. The weapon had not only saved lives, it had given voice to the resolve of every soldier and gunner who refused to yield. By January, the Germans were in retreat, their divisions shattered, their fuel gone, their dreams of Antwerp buried beneath the snow. The Allies had held not by sheer numbers alone, but by a fusion of courage and technology. The proximity fuse had multiplied American strength, turning thin lines into walls of fire, turning desperate defenses into victories. Hitler's elite formations, his panzers, his SS, his Luftwaffe, all had broken against a weapon that made no distinction between veteran and conscript. Courage and fear. Against it all were equal in death. This was the turning point. The Ardennes, which had seemed poised to fall, became instead the graveyard of Germany's last hope. The forests that once hid the enemy now betrayed them. The snowfields that seemed to promise victory became traps. The skies that once carried their ambition now rained destruction. The proximity fuse was no longer a secret. It was the storm that defined the battle. And with its arrival, Hitler's last gamble unraveled before the eyes of the world. The snowbound forests of the Ardennes that had once echoed with German confidence now lay silent, littered with shattered armor, frozen bodies, and abandoned weapons. Hitler's gamble, conceived as the stroke that would divide the Allies and force peace, had bled itself dry against an enemy he no longer understood. What began with thunder and promise on December 16th ended in silence and retreat by late January. The German offensive had failed. Antwerp remained in Allied hands. The Western Front, though scarred, stood firm. The Reich had spent its last reserves of strength and gained nothing but death. The cost was staggering. Nearly 1,000,000. German casualties littered the balance sheets of the Ardennes campaign. Of these, tens of thousands were killed outright, their bodies frozen beneath snowdrifts or buried under the rubble of villages pounded into ruin. Another 75,000 Americans fell in the battle, including 19,000 dead, one of the costliest campaigns of the war for the United States. But behind those numbers lay another truth. Without the proximity fuse, the butcher's bill would have been far higher. Studies conducted after the battle revealed the staggering impact of the new weapon. More than 2,000,000 proximity-fused shells had been fired during the Ardennes campaign. Though they represented only a quarter of all rounds expended, they accounted for over 60% of German casualties. A single airburst shell detonating 30 feet above ground could inflict as much damage as 10 conventional rounds striking soil. At Elsenborn Ridge, fuses armed only a fraction of the shells but destroyed entire SS companies. At Bastogne, they transformed hopeless odds into a stubborn defense. Along the Sauer River, they erased a battalion in minutes. The Germans themselves admitted the difference. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding the Western Front, confessed after the war that our attacks broke down not because of American courage alone, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who led panzer armies in the Ardennes, echoed the sentiment. The new shells caused panic, even among my veterans. They made every position untenable, every advance impossible. These were not the words of men beaten by numbers alone, but of commanders who recognized they had been defeated by something beyond their comprehension. Technology turned into a weapon more precise than anything they possessed. The psychological effect was just as devastating as the physical. Survivors spoke of shells that hunted them, of blasts that found them no matter where they hid. Men who trusted in trenches and stone walls, in forests of oak and pine, suddenly realized all defenses were stripped away. The battlefield itself had betrayed them. Panic spread through formations before they even reached American lines. Orders were ignored, assaults faltered, entire companies refused to advance into zones where the sky itself seemed lethal. In that winter, for the first time, German soldiers feared not the man in front of them, but the unseen intelligence inside a shell. For the Americans, the weapon became both salvation and symbol. Artillery had always been a support arm dependent on observation, timing, and guesswork. With the proximity fuse, it became decisive. A single battery could halt a regiment. A single salvo could erase a company. From December 1944 onward, American gunners no longer fired blindly, they commanded the air itself. Death could be summoned at night, in fog and snow, at ranges where no observer could see. Technology had multiplied. Courage had amplified resistance into victory. The legacy of the proximity fuse extended far beyond the Ardennes. By the war's end, more than 22 million had been produced. Factories that once built radios and refrigerators had mastered the art of miniaturization, soldering, and precision assembly. These techniques carried into the post-war world, shaping the birth of electronics, satellites, and missiles. The tiny vacuum tubes that once guided shells would one day guide rockets into space. James Van Allen, one of the scientists who perfected them, would later discover the Earth's radiation belts using the same principles. The supply chains built to coordinate 100 companies became blueprints for modern industry. Even the philosophy machines making decisions at the moment of impact was the seed of every smart weapon that followed. From guided missiles to cruise weapons to GPS bombs, all drew their lineage from the fuse that first burned above the Ardennes. But there was also a human legacy. In America, thousands of factory workers, many of them women, remembered long shifts, soldering fragile circuits, never told what they were building, only that it mattered. Their work saved the lives of men they would never meet, changed the fate of battles they would never see. In Germany, countless conscripts and veterans, boys barely grown, died in ways they could not understand. Torn apart in forests where branches became weapons, drowned in rivers where the air itself betrayed them, erased on snowy fields where the conned sky rained steel. Their deaths marked the passage into a new and merciless age of war. When the snow finally melted from the Ardennes, the battlefield revealed more than shattered tanks and broken men. It revealed the birth of a new era, an age in which technology, not numbers, decided who lived and who died. Eisenhower himself admitted that if Germany had possessed the proximity fuse on D-Day, the landings might have failed. Victory in Europe might have been delayed or lost. That was the measure of this invention, not just another weapon, but a dividing line between old war and new. Hitler's last gamble had failed not only against American soldiers, but against American science and industry. The Reich would never recover from the losses of the Ardennes. The road to Germany now lay open, and the collapse of the Third Reich was only months away. The lessons lingered. Generals and scientists alike understood that the battlefield had changed forever. War was no longer ruled by the courage of men alone, but by machines that could think, however simply, for themselves. Every soldier who looked skyward after that winter carried a new fear, that the air itself might kill. And so the Ardennes became not just the graveyard of Hitler's armies, but the birthplace of technological warfare. The proximity fuse had proven itself not as an experiment, not as a support, but as the weapon that broke an offensive and sealed a nation's fate. From that winter forward, every commander knew the truth. The future of battle lay not only in men and machines, but in the intelligence placed inside their weapons. And every soldier who marched into war knew this too, that the old rules of survival were gone. From that moment, the battlefield belonged to science. And from that moment, the sky was never the same again. From that moment, the sky was no longer just the sky. It had become the invisible weapon that decided the fate of war. The Ardennes campaign ended not with the triumphant march Hitler envisioned, but with the bitter silence of defeat. His last gamble, meant to divide the Allies and force peace, collapsed under the combined weight of stubborn resistance and an unseen revolution in warfare. The proximity fuse hidden in the nose of an ordinary shell had multiplied American firepower, turning fragile lines into walls of steel and transforming desperate defenses into decisive victories. More than numbers, more than tanks, it was this weapon that unstitched the fabric of the German offensive. Its impact reached beyond the snowbound forests of Belgium. In cold laboratories and repurposed factories, America had forged not just a weapon, but a foundation for the future. The techniques of miniaturization, the philosophy of letting machines decide the moment of death, would echo in every guided missile and smart bomb of the modern age. German generals admitted it openly. They had been beaten not by courage alone, but by science. When the snow melted and the bodies were buried, the world understood that a line had been crossed. From that winter forward, the battlefield would never again belong solely to men. The sky itself had become a weapon, and war would never be the same.